The first time he walked through the steel doors of a maximum security prison, Christopher Berry-Dee understood something most people never will. You don't meet evil in the dark. You meet it under fluorescent lights, in rooms that smell of disinfectant and metal, across tables where a murderer may sit calmly with folded hands, talking about death the way other men talk about weather. There were no screams inside those walls, no echoing madness, no dramatic shadows. Just silence. The kind that sinks into the bones and reminds you that everyone in this place has already crossed a line most human minds can't even approach. He wasn't there to play detective or to judge. He wasn't there to yell, to accuse, or to stare in shock like a civilian who'd wandered into hell. He came with a different intention, to understand. Not the crime itself but the mind behind the crime. Because the answer to stopping a killer never lives in what they did. It lives in why they could do it at all. He learned quickly that the most dangerous killers didn't posture or brag. They were calm, soft-spoken, polite. Some looked like men you'd trust with your children. Some had gentle eyes. Some laughed at jokes, thanked guards, asked about the weather. That was the first lesson. Evil doesn't always wear a snarl. Sometimes it wears a smile so ordinary you wouldn't remember it 5 minutes later. But beneath the surface, beneath the relaxed shoulders, the folded arms, the steady breathing, there was a missing piece. Something that should exist in every human being, but in them, it simply didn't. Empathy. The internal shock that stops a hand before it closes around a throat. The inner voice that says, this is a person, not an object. The invisible line the rest of the world cannot cross. These men stepped over it the way someone steps over a puddle. Berry-Dee always said the worst killers weren't the angry ones. Anger fades. Rage burns out. But emptiness? That stays. The killers with nothing inside them. No remorse, no guilt, no emotional echo, were like cracked mirrors. You could look into their eyes and see absolutely nothing reflected back. The first time he sat across from a murderer, he expected hostility. Instead, the man greeted him with a nod, spoke with manners, and described the killing so casually that it felt surreal. No shivering voice, no twisted smile, no haunted stare. Just calm memory like describing how to fix a bicycle tire. That's when Berry-Dee realized that the horror wasn't in the violence itself. The horror was in the normality of the voice telling it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. He didn't let shock ruin the conversation. If you react, the killer controls the room. If you stay still, the darkness reveals itself. Interviewing murderers wasn't about asking questions. It was about surviving their answers. Most people think killers are easy to spot. Twitching eyes, raised voices, unstable posture. But Berry-Dee learned the truth. The most successful predators survive because they master imitation. They study the world like an actor studies roles. They learn when to laugh, when to look sad, when to tilt their head in fake concern. They mimic feelings with practiced precision, not because they feel them but because they need them to blend in. That was their camouflage, not violence but charm. And that charm was what terrified him most. Not the blood. Not the details of the crime scenes. But the fact that so many victims walked straight into danger because the person who would end their life made them feel safe first. Every prison door that opened for Berry-Dee was a reminder that killers don't live in a different world. They grow up in ours. They eat at our tables, walk through our streets, nod politely at strangers and wait, not in shadows but in plain sight. The world imagines monsters with claws. He met monsters with handshakes. He left that first interview changed not because he feared the killer, but because he understood something irreversible. Evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it speaks softly and asks if you'd like a glass of water before it ends your life. And from that moment forward, he knew his work wasn't about shock value. It was about truth, the kind the world doesn't want but needs. Because the only thing more dangerous than a psychopath is a society that pretends it can't recognize one. There was a rhythm to the conversations he had with killers, a psychological dance most people would never notice unless they had spent years staring into the minds of men who felt nothing. The first stage was always performance. The murderer would sit down, adjust his posture, and decide which version of himself he wanted to present. Some chose intimidation, the silent stare, the attempt to make Berry-Dee feel small, as if the danger still belonged to them. Others chose charm, the friendly tone, the soft laugh, the "I'm not what they say I am" voice. It was all theater. And like any stage actor, they expected an audience. Berry-Dee refused to play that role. He didn't gasp when they revealed details. He didn't flinch. He didn't give them the satisfaction of reaction. If they wanted to impress him with how evil they were, he gave them nothing. If they wanted to seem intelligent, he listened without praise. Predators don't talk to you to confess. They talk to see if they still have power. That was when he learned the second rule. Never talk to a psychopath with emotion. They don't respond to it, they use it. If you get angry, they enjoy it. If you feel shocked, they feel superior. The only way to interview a killer is to become a mirror. No judgment, no fear, no admiration. Just stillness. Let them fill the silence. Eventually they do. And that was when the truth leaked through, not always in words but in tone. Some spoke with excitement when reliving the moment they ended a life. Others spoke with absolute boredom, like the act itself was no more meaningful than changing a tire. That boredom was more terrifying than the excitement. At least excitement required stimulation. Boredom meant total emotional vacancy. One killer in particular showed him this in the most disturbing way. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't brag. He simply described the moment he strangled a woman as if he were tightening the lid of a jar. She stopped moving, he said, and the room got quiet. He didn't talk about fear or guilt or even pleasure. Just quiet. It was the kind of sentence that stays in the mind for years, not because it's loud but because it's silent. That was when Berry-Dee understood that many killers didn't murder because they felt too much. They murdered because they felt nothing at all. No empathy. No connection. No recognition that the life in front of them belonged to someone who dreamed, laughed, cried, feared, loved. To a psychopath, the victim was already empty before they died. But not all killers were detached. Some were driven by something far more venomous: entitlement. They believed they had the right to decide who lived and who didn't, as if humanity were a ladder and they stood on the top rung. These men looked at the world and saw pieces, not people. Objects for use. Bodies for disposal. Faces without meaning. One of the killers Berry-Dee interviewed said, without a second of hesitation, "Some people don't deserve to live." Not whispered, not ashamed, stated like a fact. That's when Berry-Dee realized that the scariest killers weren't the ones who snapped in anger. They were the ones who believed murder was logical. And the more he listened, the more he saw the same thing behind every mask: a total absence of doubt. Normal people wrestle with their own mistakes. Psychopaths don't wrestle. They don't look back. They don't question. Their minds are not tortured. They are vacant. Years later, when people asked how he could sit across from monsters and stay composed, he always gave the same answer. You can't understand darkness by standing outside of it. And the truth he learned inside those prisons was not simply that killers exist. It was that they exist comfortably. Among us. Behind smiles. Behind normal voices. Behind the belief that evil always looks evil. The deeper the interviews went, the more Berry-Dee realized that the answers he was looking for were never in the crimes themselves, but in the distance between the act and the emotion. Some killers talked about murder as if it were a technical task. Some relived it like a story they had told too many times to feel anything. And some spoke about it the way a child might talk about a game they once played, not because the act was childish, but because the meaning of it never truly existed in their mind. He began noticing something most people would miss, not what killers said but what they didn't. They never spoke in terms of humanity. They didn't say she or he when recalling victims. They said the body, the problem, the girl, the thing. It wasn't an accident. Language exposes thought. And in their thoughts, the victim had already been stripped of identity long before the murder happened. The dehumanizing began long before the violence did. That was the moment Berry-Dee understood the real threshold between a violent person and a killer. Not the act of harming but the ability to erase someone's personhood without hesitation. Killers don't just stop a heartbeat. They erase a life the way someone erases a chalk line. Cleanly. Without emotional cost. Some of the most chilling interviews were not the ones filled with brutality, but the ones filled with reasoning. Men who explained murder like it made sense. Men who believed they had been provoked, as if existence itself was a provocation. One man calmly told him, "I didn't hate them. I just didn't see why they mattered more than my peace." That wasn't anger. That was worldview. And yet there was another group, killers who weren't born empty but hollowed out over time. Men raised in homes where pain was normal, where affection was traded for survival, where love was a language no one ever taught them. Some of these men cried when they spoke, not because they felt guilt for what they'd done, but because someone finally asked them why they became this way. Their tears weren't for their victims. They were for themselves. That was another difficult truth. Not all killers love violence. Some love control. Some love the silence after chaos. Some love the moment they no longer feel powerless. Murder, to them, is a twisted form of self-correction. A way to rewrite a world they believe has wronged them. Berry-Dee met killers who blamed childhood trauma, who blamed society, who blamed women, who blamed alcohol, who blamed fate. He also met men who blamed nothing at all. They shrugged and said, "It just happened." But murder never just happens. It is built long before it is committed, in thoughts, in resentments, in fantasies, in the quiet belief that someone else's life belongs to them. He wrote in one of his notebooks, not for publishing but to remind himself. The moment a person stops seeing another human as real, anything becomes possible. He didn't mean it metaphorically. He meant it literally. Because that was the consistent thread that connected every killer, from the rage-fueled to the calmest sociopath. Their victims were never fully human to them. Not in memory. Not in story. Not in the moment the life left the body. The world keeps asking, why do killers kill? But Berry-Dee learned that the real question is, when did their mind first decide that another person's life meant nothing? And that question has no single answer. It has thousands. Some are born without empathy. Some are taught to bury it. Some watch it die inside them slowly, quietly, over years of pain or humiliation. But once it's gone, once the internal barrier that protects life is gone, the difference between thought and action disappears. And what remains is a human shape with no human weight. That was the kind of mind Berry-Dee came to study. Not the crime. The collapse of conscience. Some killers tried to manipulate him from the moment they sat down. They weren't interested in telling the truth, they wanted control. They treated the interview like a final performance, a last stage where they could decide how they would be remembered. They wanted to be feared or pitied or admired or studied. Anything except forgotten. Because to a psychopath, being hated is still a form of power. Being ignored is not. Others tried to charm him, almost gently, as if they believed they could convince him that the world had misjudged them. They smiled. They told jokes. They acted like the crime was a small part of them, a mistake, a moment of weakness. But Berry-Dee knew something most people don't. Killers don't lie to hide the truth. They lie to control the truth. There is a difference. He learned quickly that you don't get honesty from a murderer by demanding it. You get it by letting them talk long enough for the mask to crack. Every psychopath has one moment, a pause, a slip in tone, a flash in the eye, where their real mind reveals itself. Sometimes it happened when they described the killing. Sometimes it happened when they talked about how clever they believed they were. Sometimes it happened when they thought no one was analyzing them anymore. That was when the real person surfaced. Not the polite talker, not the victim playing narrator, but the predator. The one who watched their victim's last breath not with horror, but with curiosity. The one who remembers the silence after the killing not with guilt, but with satisfaction. Berry-Dee began to notice something else too. The way some killers relived their crimes like a replayed memory they never wanted to forget. Their breathing changed. Their voice shifted. The details sharpened. It wasn't guilt pulling them back into the moment. It was pleasure. That was the haunting truth most people never understand. Some killers don't talk about murder because it bothers them. They talk about it because it keeps them alive inside. The memory is a trophy only they can feel. But not all killers sat tall with ego. Some slouched, quiet, empty, as if they had already served their purpose and were just waiting for time to end. These men were not proud. They were finished. They had nothing to prove, nothing to defend, nothing to confess. Their crime had not energized them, it had completed them. The killing wasn't a thrill. It was closure. Those were the interviews that left Berry-Dee restless. Not the ones where the killer smiled, but the ones where the killer didn't feel anything at all. A man who laughs about murder is horrifying. But a man who feels nothing while describing it, that is something far darker. Emotionless evil is not loud. It is still. The more killers he met, the more he realized that evil does not have a single face. Some are arrogant. Some are childlike. Some are bitter. Some are intelligent. Some are incredibly stupid. But all of them have one thing in common. They don't feel the weight of what they've done. Not truly. Not internally. Not in the way that stops a person from ever doing it again. You cannot teach remorse into people who don't understand why remorse exists. You cannot punish someone who only fears losing control, not losing life. And you cannot fix a mind that never believed it was broken. That was the hidden tragedy of all his interviews. Society keeps trying to heal something that cannot feel the difference between healing and emptiness. And that was when Berry-Dee stopped trying to understand murderers and started trying to expose them. The world doesn't need another romanticized image of a killer. It needs clarity. It needs warning. It needs to know how to recognize danger, not when it strikes but when it smiles. Because the kind of mind that can kill without regret doesn't arrive with a knife in hand. It arrives with a story. A voice. An innocence it learned to fake long before it learned to kill. Over time, Berry-Dee stopped being surprised by murder itself. What unsettled him more was how easily some people reached the point of taking a life, as if the act was not a moral earthquake, but a simple decision made in the moment. One man told him he didn't plan to kill anyone, he just didn't see a reason not to. Another said the person he murdered was in the way, the same word someone might use about a broken chair or a rotten piece of fruit. That was the difference. Not the violence, the value. To a psychopath, taking a life wasn't the end of a human being. It was the removal of an inconvenience. Some killers justified it with grand beliefs. Some said the world was unfair. Some said society created them. Some said their victims provoked them by existing. But beneath every excuse was the same core message: the victim didn't matter. Not as a person. Not as a story. Not as a future. The only story that mattered was the killer's. Berry-Dee once asked a murderer if he ever thought about what the victim's life could have become. The man stared blankly, then said, "Why would I imagine something that doesn't exist anymore?" That sentence, spoken without hesitation, revealed more than any confession ever could. To him, death wasn't tragic. It was final. The moment a life ended, so did its meaning. That kind of thinking wasn't fueled by rage, it was fueled by absence. No guilt. No emotional recoil. No second thoughts. Just a blank space where conscience should have lived. And that blankness, Berry-Dee learned, was far more dangerous than hatred. Hatred still requires connection. Emptiness requires nothing. But then there were the killers who were not emotionless, they were resentful. Men who didn't just kill because they felt nothing, but because they felt too much and couldn't stand the idea of anyone else being free, happy, loved, respected. These men wanted to level the world by destroying the parts of it that reminded them of what they never had. Their murders were not silent. They were statements. One killer said, "Nobody ever cared about me. Why should I care about them?" That was his logic. Not madness. Not psychosis. Just a cold rebalancing of what he believed the universe owed him. And that, Berry-Dee realized, was another dangerous truth. Some killers don't murder for pleasure. They murder for revenge against life itself. But no matter the motive, rage, emptiness, ego, entitlement, the outcome was always the same. A life ended that never got to speak again. The killers got interviews. The victims got silence. That was what drove Berry-Dee to keep writing. Not the darkness of the killers, but the absence of the victims. He wasn't there to glorify monsters. He was there to make sure the world didn't forget the people who never got to finish their stories. Because the killers always talked. The victims never did. And if no one speaks for them, the only voices left in the world are the ones that took everything from them. That was when he stopped viewing his work as documenting crime, and started seeing it as restoring balance. Not by giving killers a stage, but by stripping away the illusions they used to hide inside society. He no longer believed the question was, why do people kill? The true question, the one that mattered, was, how do we stop believing the lie that killers are easy to spot? Because the truth, the one society fears the most, is this. The most dangerous killer doesn't look dangerous. He looks familiar, normal, safe. And by the time you realize he isn't, you're already in the story he's been rehearsing. There was a prison Berry-Dee visited where the hallways were so silent that even footsteps seemed intrusive, as if noise itself didn't belong in a place where so many lives had already been erased. The guards didn't shout. They didn't rush. They moved the way people move around something dangerous they've learned to coexist with. It was there that Berry-Dee met a killer who wasn't angry, wasn't proud, wasn't unstable, just disturbingly calm. The kind of calm that didn't come from peace, but from the total absence of emotional friction inside himself. The man had murdered multiple people not because he enjoyed the act, not because he planned it with cinematic theatrics, but because, in his mind, they served no purpose anymore. He said it the way someone might talk about deleting old files on a computer. No hesitation. No echo. Just removal. That was when Berry-Dee finally understood that not all psychopaths kill for thrill or rage. Some kill for efficiency. They don't destroy out of emotion. They erase out of logic. When he asked the man what he felt during the murders, the killer replied almost politely, "I felt done. Not excited. Not horrified. Not empowered. Just done." As if killing was the final step in a list. That response haunted Berry-Dee more than any graphic confession ever had, because it revealed the real psychological divide. Empathy is not a scale. It is a switch. And for some people it never turns on. He began to realize that psychopathy isn't always loud or theatrical. Sometimes it is organized, practical, silent. Some killers don't lose control. They gain it. Their violence is not an explosion. It is a decision. That was when Berry-Dee stopped looking for emotional triggers and started looking for emotional gaps. The missing reactions. The missing hesitation. The missing moral friction. These absences didn't appear suddenly at the moment of the murder. They existed long before, in childhood and adolescence, in the quiet chapters no one noticed. A psychopath isn't someone who lacks a conscience in adulthood. They are someone who never needed one to navigate their world. What made it worse was how many of these men believed they were superior. They didn't just feel different from the rest of the world, they felt above it. Rules were for others. Laws were inventions for weak minds. Morality was an illusion for people who needed guidance. They didn't see themselves as broken. They saw themselves as free. One killer smirked as he told Berry-Dee, "You people have feelings. That's your leash." That line stayed with him for years, because it revealed the predator's real advantage. They don't just lack empathy, they exploit the fact that you don't. And it was true. Most victims didn't die because they were foolish. They died because they were human. Because they trusted. Because they helped. Because they believed danger reveals itself. But psychopaths rely on the opposite. They rely on being underestimated. That was why Berry-Dee never asked killers, "Why did you do it?" He already knew the answer. The real question, the one that mattered, was, how did everyone around you fail to see what you were? Because evil doesn't survive by hiding in shadows. It survives by fitting into the light. The most dangerous killers don't lurk. They blend. They walk among us with steady eyes, steady hands, and steady sentences, waiting for the moment empathy becomes their victim's weakness. And when that moment comes, they don't hesitate. They never did. There was a night when Berry-Dee was driving back from a prison, headlights cutting through an empty road, and he realized something that shook him more than any interview ever had. He wasn't afraid of the killers anymore. He was afraid for the ordinary people who would never see them coming. The danger wasn't the violence itself. It was the illusion that violence always looks violent. That killers come with grimaces, scars, twitching hands, or wild eyes. But the men he met didn't look like that. They looked like neighbors, bus passengers, teachers, delivery men, lovers, husbands. The kind of people you don't remember after passing them on a street. That was the part that society gets wrong. We think evil has a shape. We think it signals itself. We think we'll feel unsafe when danger is near. But the killers Berry-Dee met had mastered something far more chilling: normality. They didn't hide behind shadows. They hid behind trust. One of the men he interviewed spent years living a double life. Friendly at barbecues, polite to strangers, calm at family dinners, and at night, he drove miles away to dump the bodies of women who trusted him long enough to be alone with him. He wasn't sloppy. He wasn't loud. He wasn't impulsive. He was controlled, organized, and proud of how invisible his darkness was. That was the true survival instinct of a psychopath. Not violence, but adaptation. The ability to blend in so flawlessly that even the people closest to them never feel the storm in the room until it hits them directly. Berry-Dee started seeing the world differently after enough of these encounters. When a stranger smiled too kindly, when a man spoke too smoothly, when someone offered help with a tone that felt rehearsed, he didn't panic, but he noticed. Because killers don't just choose their victims. They study them. They learn their fears, their loneliness, their politeness, their need to avoid conflict, their instinct to trust. And they use it all, not with rage but with patience. One killer said something that defined everything Berry-Dee learned: victims pick themselves. I just wait. That sentence burned itself into his mind. It meant the killer didn't chase in alleys or hunt in shadows. He waited for kindness, for trust, for humanity, because that's what he fed on. The more he listened, the more it became clear. Killers don't just kill bodies. They kill the belief that the world is safe. They destroy the invisible comfort most people live inside without realizing it, the belief that you can identify danger by looking at it. That belief is the first thing a psychopath strips away. And that was when Berry-Dee knew his work wasn't about fear. It was about correction. The world doesn't need to panic. It needs to stop assuming a smiling face equals a safe one. Because psychopaths don't walk toward the darkness. They walk with it quietly inside them. And they let the rest of the world mistake silence for safety. There was a moment in Berry-Dee's work when the interviews stopped feeling like isolated conversations and started forming a pattern. Not a pattern of methods or crime scenes, but a pattern of mindsets. He noticed how many killers believed they were the ones who had been wronged. They didn't think of themselves as predators. They thought of themselves as correctors, as if murder was not an act of destruction, but a response to something the world had done to them first. Some felt rejected. Some felt ignored. Some felt entitled to affection, obedience, or respect, and killed when they didn't receive it. But underneath every explanation was the same poisonous belief: my emotions are more important than their existence. It didn't matter whether the trigger was small or catastrophic. They all believed the same thing: their pain justified someone else's death. One man spent the entire interview explaining how the women he killed should have known better, as if breathing in his presence was a crime. Another claimed he killed because no one ever listened to him, as though murder were a louder form of speech. That wasn't confusion. That was narcissism sharpened into a weapon. And then there were the ones who didn't bother justifying anything. They didn't care about sympathy. They didn't want understanding. They didn't seek forgiveness. They simply existed in a world where their wants were the only reality. These men were not wounded. They were untouched and unmoved. Their crimes weren't emotional eruptions. They were decisions. Logical. Permanent. Berry-Dee noticed another pattern. Most killers didn't remember their victims as people. They remembered them as moments. They recalled the way the room smelled, the way the air felt before the attack, the way their heartbeat slowed as the victim stopped. They remembered sensations, not souls. That's what separated a killer from a murderer. A murderer may regret the act. A killer remembers the feeling. He found something else buried in their conversations. Not just the act of killing, but the need to relive it. Many killers didn't talk because they wanted to confess. They talked because the memory was the only time they ever felt fully alive. They wanted to re-enter the moment, not to explain it, but to experience it again in their minds. That was when Berry-Dee understood the true meaning of danger. It isn't the man who kills once out of chaos. It's the man who kills to feel something, because once he learns that death gives him life inside, he will come back to it. Not out of need but addiction. The world wants killers to be insane because insanity feels like distance. But most of the men Berry-Dee met were not insane at all. They were rational, calm, self-serving, emotionally dead in one direction and hyper-focused in another. You could talk to them for an hour and never feel afraid, until you processed what they said after they left the room. That was the real horror, not that these men existed but that they could sit across from you and seem almost normal. And that led Berry-Dee to one of the most important realizations of his life. The most dangerous killer is not the one you fear. It's the one you never thought about twice. The one who doesn't give you a reason to run. The one who looks like everyone else. Because people don't survive by identifying evil. They survive by recognizing it before it smiles. Among all the killers Berry-Dee studied, there was one type that disturbed him more than the lone predator. The kind who didn't kill in isolation but recruited others into the darkness with him. That was what made the case of John Bunting so terrifying, not just as a crime, but as a psychological blueprint. Bunting was not a monster who hid in the shadows. He was a leader, a planner, a collector of weak minds. And he didn't just commit murder, he taught it. Bunting wasn't driven by impulse. He was driven by ideology, the kind that wraps itself in righteousness to disguise cruelty. He believed certain people were useless, waste, better off dead. He targeted the vulnerable, the poor, the bullied, the disabled, the outcasts no one would go looking for. But what made him uniquely dangerous wasn't who he killed. It was how he convinced others to help him do it. He didn't use force. He used belief. He spoke with conviction. He played the role of protector, hero, avenger. He convinced ordinary people that murder wasn't murder, it was cleansing. He framed violence as justice, cruelty as duty, and death as purification. Some followed him not because they were killers, but because they were empty enough to let someone else do their thinking for them. That was what haunted Berry-Dee. Bunting didn't just erase lives. He erased morality in the minds of others. He proved something most people don't want to admit: evil doesn't always spread through blood. Sometimes it spreads through ideas. And the victims? They weren't chosen for what they did. They were chosen for what they lacked: power, protection, visibility. They were people the world had already pushed to the edges. People who struggled to be seen. People who could vanish without anyone noticing the silence left behind. That was the perfect hunting ground for a psychopath. Not chaos, but invisibility. One victim trusted Bunting because he spoke like a friend. Another because he offered protection. Another because he acted like the only person who listened. That was the cruelest part: the victims never feared him. They trusted him. They thought the danger was outside their lives, not sitting across from them at the table. Berry-Dee didn't tell this story to shock, but to reveal a truth most people never face. Some killers don't hunt alone. Some don't use violence to dominate, they use words. Some don't kill because they hate the world, they kill because they believe the world would be better without certain people in it. And those killers are far more dangerous than the ones who stab in alleyways. Because they don't just end lives. They recruit. They persuade. They infect. They show that psychopathy is not always a solo disease. Sometimes, it is contagious. That was the real lesson of John Bunting, a warning disguised as a case file. Evil doesn't always work alone. And when it learns to speak instead of scream, it becomes harder to fight than any knife or gun could ever be. What made the Bunting case linger in Berry-Dee's mind wasn't only the brutality of the murders, but the quietness of the victims' lives before they died. They weren't powerful. They weren't wealthy. They weren't surrounded by people who could protect them. Some were disabled. Some were poor. Some were lonely. Some were so used to being ignored that when someone finally paid attention to them, even in a twisted way, they mistook it for care. That was the part that never left him. These people didn't just lose their lives, they lost them to someone they trusted more than the world had ever trusted them. One victim had spent his life being called useless by society, forgotten even by the people who should have loved him. Then Bunting came along, offering friendship, protection, belonging, and by the time the trap was visible, it was already closed. Another was mocked for his differences, isolated in his own neighborhood, treated like a burden instead of a human being. Bunting didn't see a person. He saw a target no one would defend. That was his genius. He didn't hunt the strong. He hunted the invisible. Berry-Dee realized something horrifying. The reason killers like Bunting succeed is not because they are extraordinary, but because the world fails the same people they choose as victims. A predator doesn't need to be brilliant when society already creates the silence they can drag bodies into. That was the real cruelty. Murder didn't begin with death. It began with neglect. He wrote once privately, "Some killers don't find the forgotten. They wait for the world to forget them first." That was the truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Killers didn't always outsmart the system. Sometimes they just used the cracks no one bothered to seal. And while killers like Bunting are remembered, the victims remain nameless in most people's minds, reduced to numbers, timelines, paragraphs in a case file. But they were more than that. They had birthdays, favorite meals, memories only they carried. They had hopes, maybe small ones, maybe quiet ones, but they had them. And someone decided those hopes were disposable. That was why Berry-Dee's work was never about glorifying predators. It was about restoring the balance. It was about refusing to let the killer's story be the only one that lived. Because killers always get to speak. Victims don't. And unless someone refuses to let the silence win, the predator becomes the protagonist. That was the deeper purpose behind every interview, every page, every psychological analysis he ever wrote. Not to give killers a spotlight, but to remove the illusion that they are anything more than destroyers of lives that meant something. He knew that most people want to believe evil is a monster you can see coming. A shadow, a scream, a weapon in hand. But the truth he had seen again and again was this. Evil doesn't always come with blood on its clothes. Sometimes it comes with comfort in its voice. Sometimes it comes with a smile that finally makes someone feel seen. Sometimes it arrives disguised as the only person who didn't walk past you in silence. That was why the world needed to understand, you don't protect yourself by fearing monsters. You protect yourself by recognizing the ones who learn to look like rescuers. As the years went on, Berry-Dee began to understand that the true danger wasn't that killers existed. It was that most of them didn't feel like killers when you sat across from them. They didn't radiate darkness. They didn't emit threat. Some were soft-spoken. Some were articulate. Some were painfully ordinary. That was the part people outside prison walls never believed until it was too late. A murderer doesn't need to look like a nightmare to create one. He often replayed conversations in his mind, trying to locate the exact moment the monster revealed itself. A shift in tone, a flicker in the eye, a single misplaced word. But most of the time there wasn't a moment. The horror wasn't in an eruption. It was in the stillness. In the way a man could say, "I ended her life," as casually as someone might say, "I turned off the light." Some of the killers he interviewed didn't even consider what they did to be evil. They saw themselves as practical, efficient, even necessary. They believed the world was full of waste, and they were doing what others were too weak to do. It wasn't madness. It was logic without empathy. And that combination, intellect without conscience, was the most lethal formula he'd ever seen in a human being. There was a moment in one interview when a man serving life without parole leaned forward and asked Berry-Dee almost curiously, "Do you think I'm evil?" The question wasn't emotional. It wasn't defensive. It sounded like he was asking whether a shirt fit well or whether a meal had enough salt. Berry-Dee didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. Evil wasn't the fire people imagined. It was the absence of temperature completely. But there were moments that caught even him off guard. Moments when killers seemed to mimic sadness, guilt, even grief. They spoke of childhood wounds, lost love, betrayal. For a second you could almost believe they felt something. But Berry-Dee had learned to tell the difference. Remorse reflects outward. Self-pity reflects inward. A psychopath can say, "I'm sorry," but what they mean is, "I wish this hadn't affected me." There was one man who cried when speaking of his childhood abuse, tears rolling down his face as he talked about how no one ever protected him. An hour later, when asked about the woman he strangled, he shrugged as if he'd been asked to recall the weather. No tears. No tremor. No internal shift. That contrast said more than any psychological report ever could. The killers weren't empty in every direction. They just had all their emotion wired inward. They could feel anger, frustration, embarrassment, but never responsibility. Never guilt. Never the crushing awareness that another person's suffering should matter. That was when Berry-Dee stopped believing that evil was a force. It was a void. A space where empathy should live but never grew. A place where the self expands and others disappear. The killers didn't destroy lives because they hated people. They destroyed lives because people were never real to them. And that truth, quiet, simple, and unstoppable, was what made him realize something far more terrifying than murder itself. You cannot stop a person from killing if the thing that prevents killing, empathy, does not exist in them to begin with. People often asked Berry-Dee the same question. Did any of them ever regret what they did? And he always gave the same answer, not in the way you want them to. Some regretted being caught. Some regretted losing freedom. Some regretted trusting the wrong accomplice. Some even regretted choosing the wrong victim, as if murder were a business decision that could have gone more smoothly. But true regret, the kind that crushes a human soul, requires the ability to feel the weight of someone else's pain, and that was the very thing these men lacked. Remorse wasn't missing because they were stubborn. It was missing because their minds were not built to feel it. A normal person lies awake at night replaying a mistake they made years ago. A psychopath sleeps peacefully after taking a life. Not because they're fearless, but because conscience is a language they never learned. To them, guilt is not a burden. It is a concept. In one interview, Berry-Dee asked a killer whether he ever thought about the moment his victim realized they were going to die. The man tilted his head, confused, and said, "Why would I think about that? That's their problem, not mine." And that was the dividing line. Normal people live connected to others. Psychopaths live in a world of one. Some killers went as far as performing remorse, shaping their tone, lowering their voice, softening their eyes, hoping pity would replace punishment. But Berry-Dee knew the difference between emotion and performance. One comes from the chest. The other comes from the brain. Psychopaths don't feel grief, they imitate the appearance of it. Because they learned something crucial. Empathy may not exist inside them, but it is a currency outside them. And yet, what haunted Berry-Dee the most wasn't the ones who pretended to be sorry. It was the ones who never pretended at all, not out of honesty but because they couldn't understand why anyone expected remorse in the first place. Those men didn't need masks. Their truth was already empty. One killer said to him casually, "People die. Animals die. I just helped the process along." Another said, "We're all temporary. I just made some people temporary sooner." These weren't jokes. These were beliefs, the worldview of someone who sees death not as tragedy but as timing. But the darkest truth wasn't about the killers. It was about the world they came from. Many of them walked through life unnoticed long before they ever held a weapon. They learned to mimic emotion because it made others comfortable. They learned to speak gently because it made others trust. They learned to look harmless because it made others blind. Psychopaths are not shaped by evil ideas. They are shaped by a world that reacts to appearances. And if appearance looks safe, people stop asking questions. That was when Berry-Dee understood his mission wasn't just to expose killers. It was to expose the illusion that allows them to keep existing. Because people don't die from not knowing violence exists. People die because they think they will recognize it when it arrives. The more years he spent inside prisons, the more Berry-Dee realized the world outside them was built on a comforting lie, the belief that evil announces itself. That if someone were dangerous, we'd feel it. That there would be something in their expression, something in their voice, something in their presence that would trigger instinct. But every killer he met was living proof of the opposite. The most dangerous people in the world don't trigger fear. They trigger nothing. They blend into the background of daily life so quietly that you don't even remember what shirt they were wearing 5 minutes after seeing them. He often thought about how many victims would still be alive if society didn't look for danger in the wrongly imagined places. In the loud, the strange, the unhinged, while the real predator sat across the room smiling, patient, controlled, invisible. Psychopaths survive not because they are brilliant, but because the world is blind in the wrong direction. One of the killers Berry-Dee interviewed explained how he chose his victims. He didn't follow them through alleys or break into their homes. He watched them interact. He noticed the ones who apologized too quickly. The ones who smiled when uncomfortable. The ones who held eye contact too long because they didn't want to seem rude. To a predator, politeness is not just a trait, it's an opening. That was when Berry-Dee truly understood the psychology of predation. Killers don't just hunt weakness. They hunt humanity. They watch for kindness, trust, loneliness, compliance, because those are the doors empathy leaves unlocked. He once wrote, "A psychopath's weapon is not the knife. It's the assumption that they would never use it." That sentence became the anchor of his work. Because every killer he met relied not on force but on belief. The belief that danger will look like danger, that violence comes with warning signs, that the people around us are always safe until they prove otherwise. But killers like Bunting, like McDuff, like countless others inside those walls, they never wasted time proving otherwise. They didn't walk into a room as a threat. They walked in as someone who made you drop your guard, and then waited for you to hand them the knife without realizing it. The more he wrote, the more he understood that society keeps asking the wrong question: how do we spot a killer? But the real question is, why do we assume we can? Because killers don't exist on the edge of society. They exist in the parts we refuse to question. At family tables. At workplaces. In relationships. In friendships. In moments where trust is so natural that suspicion feels ridiculous. That is the ecosystem of a psychopath, not shadows but acceptance. Not fear but comfort. Not chaos but routine. And that was the hardest truth of all. Evil doesn't need to break in. It just waits for someone to hold the door. As the interviews piled up, a question began haunting Berry-Dee more than any other. Not why do killers exist? But how many of them are still out there, unrecognized, unchallenged, unnoticed? Because not every psychopath ends up in prison. Not every predator leaves evidence. Not every evil act gets exposed. Some killers don't get caught because they're lucky. Others don't get caught because they never needed violence to satisfy the emptiness inside them. They controlled, manipulated, used, discarded, all without ever spilling blood. And society never calls those people killers, even when they destroy lives in slower, quieter ways. He began to see a terrifying spectrum of psychopathy. On one end, the physical murderer, the one who leaves bodies behind. On the other end, the emotional predator, the one who leaves no scars you can photograph. Both lacked empathy. Both lived without remorse. Both saw people as tools, not souls. The only difference was method. That was when Berry-Dee stopped believing in the Hollywood version of evil. Real evil didn't need knives. Real evil didn't need basements. Real evil didn't need a reason. It only needed opportunity, and the terrifying truth was that the world is full of people willing to trust someone who looks harmless. He once wrote in his notes, "A killer isn't always someone who wants death. Sometimes it's someone who wants control." That sentence followed him everywhere because it explained every kind of psychopath he had ever met. The charming ones, the quiet ones, the explosive ones, the calculating ones. Their motives were different. But their mindset was identical. People exist for me. And he knew then, without denial or hesitation, that society's greatest weakness wasn't violence. It was innocence. We teach children to share toys, not to recognize manipulation. We teach kindness, not boundaries. We teach empathy, not self-protection. We teach people to assume good, and when they assume wrong they don't get a second chance to correct the mistake. The killers understood that better than anyone. One said to Berry-Dee almost proudly, "The world makes it easy for people like me. Everyone wants to think they're safe." Another said, "If someone doubts me, I fix it. I smile." That was the moment Berry-Dee wrote the most important line of his life. Evil doesn't hide behind darkness. It hides behind what you want to believe. Because people don't fear what looks friendly. They don't question what looks normal. They don't study the face that smiles back. And that is how a killer survives, not by overpowering others, but by letting others identify themselves as prey through trust, politeness, guilt, hesitation, or loneliness. He didn't come out of those prisons thinking the world was full of killers. He came out understanding something more unsettling. The world is full of places where killers can live without being noticed. And as long as humanity keeps believing danger wears a visible mask, the ones with invisible ones will continue to walk freely, not because they are hidden, but because the world never looked. The longer he studied them, the more Berry-Dee understood something he never expected. The true power of a psychopath was never in their violence. It was in their believability. They didn't force the world to trust them. The world chose to. People let them close. People dismissed the quiet red flags. People gave them more chances than they deserved, because no one wants to believe that danger can come wrapped in charm, humor, kindness, or calmness. We don't fear what smiles. We fear what snarls. And that is why the smiling ones walk longest among us. He began to see that the stories of killers weren't just stories of murder, they were stories of access. Every victim let a killer near them for a reason. For help. For love. For comfort. For protection. For friendship. For attention. The killers did not break into lives violently. They were invited in. The door wasn't smashed open. It was opened gently and held. That was the part that changed him most. Not the brutality but the betrayal. The idea that the last face a victim ever saw was not always a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it was someone they trusted, smiled at, walked beside, loved, or believed in. That truth was heavier than blood. Because it meant the weapon wasn't the knife. The weapon was belief. And the killers knew it. Berry-Dee wrote in his journal once, "Most victims did not fail to fight. They failed to suspect." And that was the lesson no one wants to learn. Because it means danger doesn't live far from us. It lives in the space we leave unguarded, the space we label as safe. He understood then why people are fascinated by psychopaths, because they represent the nightmare hidden inside normality. They prove that you can know someone's face and never know their mind. They force us to confront the idea that evil is not always an intruder. Sometimes it's a guest. But he also knew something else, something quieter but just as important. Psychopaths do not win because they are brilliant. They win because they are trusted. And trust, once given, does not come with an alarm. That is why his work was never about fear-mongering. It was about removing illusions. Not to make the world darker but to make it clearer. Because the world doesn't need more panic. It needs awareness. It needs people to understand that danger is not always a shadow. Sometimes it's a familiar voice. Sometimes it's a helpful hand. Sometimes it's the person who says, "I'll walk you home." And sometimes it's the one who doesn't need to threaten you at all, because they already know you'll follow. Berry-Dee didn't fear killers anymore. He feared a world that keeps pretending it knows how to recognize one. In the end, after all the locked doors, all the recorded voices, all the interviews spoken through glass and metal and ego, Berry-Dee understood something that had taken him years to see clearly. You don't study killers to understand death. You study them to understand life, what it means, how fragile it is, how easily it can be dismissed by someone who never felt its value in the first place. Every time he walked out of a prison, the air outside felt sharper, heavier, more real. Because he had just spent hours in the company of men who treated life like a disposable object. And yet the world still moved on, unaware. He didn't come out with fear. He came out with responsibility. A responsibility to say the things people prefer not to hear. To write what most would rather keep distant. To remind the world that victims don't choose their killers, but killers choose their victims. And they choose them based on the very traits the world encourages. Trust, empathy, openness, softness, hope. The things that make someone beautifully human are the things a psychopath sees as points of entry. But what truly stayed with him were not the killer's voices. It was the silence of the people they erased. The birthdays they never reached. The conversations they never finished. The futures that vanished without echo. The laughter that ended mid-breath. He carried those absences with him like invisible archives, because killers may give interviews, but victims leave shadows. And someone has to make sure those shadows are not stepped over. People think the frightening part of evil is its presence. But the truly frightening part is its normality. Evil doesn't always storm in. Sometimes it knocks politely. Sometimes it offers comfort. Sometimes it blends in so perfectly that by the time you recognize it, you're already standing at the edge of something you won't walk back from. That was why Berry-Dee never chased cinematic danger. He chased the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need a weapon to begin with, only opportunity and a world too polite to name what it sees. And after hearing hundreds of killers speak, after mapping the cold architecture of minds without empathy, he reached a final truth, the one that sits at the heart of every interview, every page, every warning he ever wrote. A psychopath is not terrifying because they kill. A psychopath is terrifying because they don't care that they did. And if humanity ever forgets that, if it ever starts believing again that evil must look monstrous to exist, then the killers won't need to hide at all. They will walk in plain sight. They will blend into conversations. They will pass through doors held open by unsuspecting hands. And they will go unnoticed until someone disappears. Not loudly but quietly. Not with a scream, but with a silence no one realizes is missing. His work was never meant to glorify darkness. It was meant to name it, so that the living could recognize it before it smiled at them. Because the truth about evil is simple. It doesn't fear being seen. It only fears being recognized.